Well, good morning, COS Patriots. Welcome to COS Live. We are just moments away from a New Hampshire House Committee on Senate Federal Relations and Veteran Affairs. We're going to be hearing our Article 5 application in just a few moments. Rita, it is great to be back with you as the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs and also my co-host. Could you give us a rundown of what's going to happen today?
Sure. Well, again, we are in New Hampshire. This is the House State and Federal Relations and Veterans Affairs Committee. And Andrew, right now, interestingly, they are having a hearing on a 34 ready bill. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, that is legislation that basically sets forth how New Hampshire will choose and then oversee its commissioners to an Article 5 convention once we get to convention. So this is another great bill also related to Article 5. Maybe we'll get to hear a little bit of the testimony on that. But in just a few moments, actually scheduled for 9:45 a.m. Eastern, we'll see if they stick to that or not. But they will be hearing our Article 5 application there in this committee this morning. And Andrew, we have been winning so far for Convention of States. You know, we've already passed just this year, this month, in the South Dakota Senate, the Wyoming Senate. We've had a lot of good wins. I will be the first to tell you that this is going to be an uphill battle. This is a tough committee. There are 10 Republicans and 8 Democrats on this committee, and we do think we have most of the Republicans in support, but we have a couple that we're not sure where they stand. We think most of the Democrats on this committee are not in favor. We do expect to have Rick Santorum there to testify, and our regional director, Haley Shaw. It was going to be a tight travel morning for them to get him to this committee hearing on time, but hopefully he is en route and almost there or already there now. So hopefully we'll hear from both Haley and Senator Rick Santorum giving testimony this morning, as well as a number of our grassroots supporters there in New Hampshire. Our sponsor here is Representative J.D. Bernardi. He is just a great COS champion, great supporter, very knowledgeable. So we should hear him introduce the resolution, and it is referred to as HCR 3 there in New Hampshire. So that's what I'm looking for, and they should be starting there any minute, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, while we wait, I think I want to go back to what you said just a moment ago about this being an uphill battle and how there's 10 Republicans and 8 Democrats, I believe you said. I think it's a good time to remind our viewers that we are a nonpartisan organization, and we are reaching out to people on the right and the left and in the center. And there's a lot of work to do, even among Republicans. You know, a lot of people think that we're just a conservative issue or a Republican issue, and we're not. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we want to see amendments to the Constitution that would benefit all Americans, not just some on the right or some on the left or any political affiliation. Anyway,
Andrew,
I think, go ahead.
yeah, I am not sure what's happening in the hearing room, but it looks like they just switched around and one of the members went to the desk. Maybe we should listen in and just make sure we know what's happening there. Okay, well, it looks like they haven't quite started yet, but maybe getting ready to start any minute. So sorry to interrupt you, Andrew.
No, that's fine. This is part of grassroots reporting.
Yeah.
So the committee hearing is going to be starting in a moment. But yeah, and it's exciting what you were saying, how we're just winning everywhere right now, and hopefully this carries in New Hampshire today.
Yeah. Andrew, great breaking news. I've just received word from Haley Shaw that Rick is there. So,
incredible.
Yeah, praise the Lord for that. Things are going according to plan, and he'll be there to give testimony. And just for viewers who might not be already familiar with Convention of States and where we are in the process, 19 states have already passed our Article 5.
We have a lot of pink cards, which is great. So I'm going to run this through. I want to let the prime sponsor fully develop his position. When we get to other folks, because of the many, many pink cards we have, I do not want to have to be in a position to limit testimony. So if someone has given some testimony and touched on some points that you were going to make, this is on YouTube, it's being recorded. So don't feel the need to repeat things. We're looking for new information with every new testimony. So with that, welcome Representative Bernardi, the prime sponsor.
Thank you, Chairman Moffat and committee. Glad to see you all again. For the record, Representative J.D. Bernardi, Rockingham 36, Hampton Falls, Kensington, Southampton, Newton, and Plastow. So I am here to offer HCR 3, a concurrent resolution applying for a convention of states under Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States. And I know that there are many new members here, and you heard some of Article 5 I guess, procedures already, but I just want to reprise that quickly for the committee. What is an Article 5? It's a procedure to amend the Constitution. And there are two methods. Congress, with a 2/3 vote, can propose amendments, or 2/3 of the states can make an application for a convention to propose amendments. And those would be limited purpose conventions with specific uniform applications to amend, not redraft, the Constitution. That convention comes up with the wording of the amendments that are then presented either from Congress or from the convention to 3/4 of the states to ratify. Well, all the states to ratify, and 3/4 in order for it to actually be ratified. To become part of the Constitution. Now, why was this two-part process or two-mechanism way adopted? So the initial proposal being discussed at the Constitutional Convention was that only Congress was going to propose the amendments. And that was supported by Madison, the father of our Constitution. And remember, he didn't support the first 10 amendments and what became the 27th as well, but led their way to advancement when he became a congressman in the first Congress. But during that Constitutional Convention, George Mason stood up and said, congressional role alone would be excessive, exceptional, and dangerous. The plan now formed will certainly be defective, as the Confederation has found on trial to be. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary, and it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way than trust to chance and violence. It would be improper to require the consent of the national legislature because they may abuse their power and refuse to consent to that very account. So basically, Mason stood up and said, Congress, if there is a need, may decide that they don't want to deal with this issue. Eldridge Gerry, our erstwhile neighbor to the south, proposed the state convention process. It was unanimously adopted on the last day of the convention. Madison then switched his support to it and spoke to it in Federalist 43. There has also been great concern that the actual constitutional convention that dealt with this was not legitimate. In 1786, the Annapolis Convention on Trade and Commerce resulted in Virginia's call for devising and discussing all alterations and further provisions as may be necessary to render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies of the Union. You had 6 states then call for a constitutional convention. Then the actual Confederation Congress issued their decree. And then 6 other states followed. The only one that didn't was Rhode Island. Madison, speaking about this in a letter to Jefferson, said, the recommendations from the meeting at Annapolis of the plenipotentiary, meaning we're going to do the whole thing. Convention in Philadelphia in May next has been well received. Indeed, the evidence of dangerous defects of the Confederation has at length proselyted the most obstinate adversaries to reform. Madison in his diary then wrote, all agreed and owned that the federal government in its existing shape was inefficient and could be lost. Members of the southern and middle states seemed generally anxious about some Republican organization of a system which could preserve the Union and give due energy to the government of it. In the handout I provided you, I gave you the actual commissions of those 12 states saying we want to have a convention to deal with the issues in a plenipotentiary way. And I gave you the list of 42 documented conventions that have been held since the Europeans came to this continent. In no case were these runaways. I give you this information because there are those that are going to follow and say, if you have an Article 5 convention, it will be a runaway. It can be a runaway. It'll be a disaster. I wanted to put a stake through the heart of that fantasy. That is not true. You have the commissions of the states that said, we want to do this. We want to have a revision of the articles and create a new government. And you have the examples of conventions that have been held where there has been no runaway problems. Now, Article 5 conventions have been tried in the past and never happened in the United States to this point, but they have been drivers of change. And I gave you two examples. In 1912, 29 of the necessary 31 states pushed for direct election of senators. That caused the Congress to act. They created the 17th Amendment. In 1983, we got 32 states of the 34 necessary at that time to pursue balanced budget amendment. The result was Congress passed the Graham-Rudman-Hollings provisions the following 2 years. So you can see that even if a movement for a convention doesn't actually get there, it can be a spur to Congress to act, because they oftentimes do not want to take actions against their power and authority, and the budget amendment is clear. So what is HCR 3 proposing? Basically, controls in 3 different areas. First, to discuss potential options for fiscal restraints on the federal government. Right now, we have almost a $37 trillion debt. When I spoke on this measure 2 years ago, it was around 32 trillion. It is clearly out of control. Hence, there's a very strong movement for some kind of balanced budget amendment, and as well as a tax revenue cap proposal. There could be other items that fall under fiscal constraints, but those seem to be the 2 most common. Second, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Well, this comes from the fact that we have an administrative state that is ruling far too much of our life. We have a Supreme Court that has made decisions, particularly on the interstate commerce clause, where they decided that growing wheat on one's own farm for one's own use was interstate commerce. Once they did that, the door was open, and Congress could make a law on anything, citing it was compliant with Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And Article 1, Section 8, if you remember, that's where it lists these are the powers of Congress. Everything else that's not here belongs to the states. Well, they've taken that and they've run with it. So we have massive amounts of power that Congress has accrued to itself to make laws that we are not in favor of, if from a state perspective, or create an administrative state that does the same. So the kinds of things that could be considered and discussed in a convention on this particular item would be proper definition of the Commerce Clause, or state laws, state opportunity to abrogate laws, regulations, executive orders of court decisions. A proposal, 3/4 of the states or 2/3 of the states, if faced with a law that says, all right, everybody has to drive EVs by 2050, say, no, we're not going to do that. If enough states decide that they want to, in a proposal like that, if that was a constitutional amendment, that states had that authority, one could overturn a inappropriate overreaching of Congress or the executive. Reversing the 17th Amendment, restoring state legislatures back to deciding who is going to be their senators. So the senators work for the states and protect state interests rather than the broad general public, where our state representatives are supposed to take that task. Congressional override of Supreme Court decisions by a supermajority, sunsetting of agencies, congressional approval of agency regulations. Right now, the Constitution says that the Congress is the only entity that can make laws. Yet we have administrative agencies making most of our laws. Something's wrong with that equation. So there are multiple areas of discussion for proposals for amendment under this broad topic. And finally, the third topic is limitation of terms of office for officials and for members of Congress. So term limits for representatives and senators, term limits for senior federal officials working in the government, term limits for judges and justices. These are all potential proposals under this broad rubric, and that could be discussed and amendments hence proposed. I'd like to point out that Linda Massimella, a former member of this committee, and I were honored to participate in a simulated Article 5 Convention of States in August of 2023. With legislators from every state, and it was an outstanding success, and I think truly demonstrated the opportunity that this kind of procedure could hold. But bottom line, you as state legislators are a nation's last line of defense against an all-powerful, overreaching federal government. The framers preserved this task for you as your birthright. You are enabled to reclaim the people's power. 19 states have done so. I urge you to be the 20th. The issue deserves full consideration in the House. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Sponsor, Representative Bernardi. You said the Article 5 was adopted unanimously in Philadelphia. Is that what I
Article
heard?
5, the proposal of having, yes, both the congressional route and the state route, and it was discussed for on several rounds, and finally, Colonel Mason was able to convince all that it was appropriate and necessary.
Representative Gagny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative, for taking my question. I'm looking at the prior bill and I'm looking at your bill. My understanding is that you want the same outcome as HB 264 for an Article 5 convention. Could you tell me, if any, what the difference between your bill and the other bill? Would yours accomplish more?
I don't think so. The key language is having the state agree that it wants to move forward in the 3 areas, and the 3 areas are the same.
Thank you.
And I would point out that Representative Bernardi's measure is an HCR. It's a House concurrent resolution. The previous measure was a HB, was a House bill. So there was a distinction there. Representative Foss, I'm sure Representative Bernardi would love to have a question from you.
Thank you. And thank you, Representative Bernardi. I just want a clarification, and I apologize, I don't have your resolution in front of me. So in your handout here, you say each state gets 1 vote like in the Electoral College, but I think anyone who's stayed up all night on election night knows that not every state in the under the Electoral College gets 1 vote. So can you just clarify, in your resolution, is it 1 state, 1 vote, or is it a situation like the Electoral College?
No, it's in a convention, each state gets 1 vote.
So this is
Yes,
Follow-up?
unlike that, yes.
Representative Mandelbaum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Bernardi. I have a follow-up to Representative Foss's question. So can states determine how many delegates they send to a convention, but they'd still have 1 vote?
Yes, states can send as many delegates as they want. In the original articles of Confederation, you could send as many you want. You needed 2 to agree, or a majority to agree. You needed 2 at least to make a vote. If only 1 showed up, your state didn't get a vote. You needed at least 2 to participate, and you have your vote count. But if you had 17 show up, you had to have a majority opinion, and that was your 1 vote.
All right, thank you. Follow-up?
Follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first, thank you for this handout. I'm finding it very useful as someone who has not had a civics lesson on this topic. So on the back side of the sheet, you give some examples of what these different amendments could be. In a constitutional convention, are delegates or states typically voting on a package of amendments or specific things, like a separate amendment that would have term limits for representatives, and another amendment that would have term limits for judges?
Okay, first, it's not a constitutional convention. It's an articles convention.
Okay.
But yes, every particular proposal that is discussed, and I gave examples of items that could be discussed and potentially turned into amendments under those 3 topic areas. Every one of those would be a separate amendment that then would be proposed to all the states, requiring 3/4 of them to ratify.
All right, thank you.
Other questions for the prime? Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative, for bringing us this bill. I have a question because I'm a little bit agnostic on the concept. I don't disagree in the least with your intent behind doing this, but when I look at the actual process and how to go about it, and I look at, for instance, Amendment 1, abridging the freedom of speech. Well, we've recently seen a lot of censorship on the internet that was asked for by federal government. We see Amendment 2, shall not be infringed. It's feeling pretty infringed in a lot of ways. Amendment 4, secure persons, houses, papers, and effects. It seems like the federal government is spying on just about everybody all the time. Article 4, Section 4 guarantees to each state a Republican form of government that will be protected from invasion. So if the Constitution is really good, and I tend to think it is really good, and the federal government just isn't following it, why does changing the letter of the Constitution change what the federal government is doing?
Well, I think it boils down to areas where the Congress, as well as the courts, have allowed some fuzzy interpretations of what the Constitution is. I mean, the Constitution is what, 4 or 5 pages printed out. It's a statement of key principles, and those amendments are a matter of a few lines. And so, what do they mean? You can get, as I mentioned, the Interstate Commerce Clause, for an example, where there was a court case that said growing wheat on your own land for your own use impacted interstate commerce. Well, that gave Congress the right to do anything. That is not what was legitimately meant by addressing interstate commerce. By the same token, you're talking about, infringement of freedom of speech, the Second Amendment rights, search and seizure, censorship. I mean, these are areas that are all currently in the court system in various arenas. If we get bad decisions there and Congress goes along with them, then that could be an area for an Article 5 convention to say, hey, we need to turn this back to mean this and be much more clear and specific. So it's an opportunity to fix where these issues have gone off the rail.
Other questions for the Prime? Representative Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, sir. Previously, we did House Bill 264, and that called for a balanced budget. And in reading your HCR, it calls for imposed fiscal restraints. Would balanced budget be included in that fiscal restraint?
Yes, as you noted when I on the backside of my comments, I indicate that a balanced budget is within that broader rubric, as well as tax caps or other controls on government spending.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions? Representative Bernardi, go ahead. And then Representative Siebert.
Quick clarification. So in your next page, I like all the goals, very interesting. One thing that I want to know more about it is sunset agencies. Could you talk more about this? What are the agencies that you want to sunset?
These are not my proposals. What I did was list under the concept of limit power and jurisdiction of the federal government, what are the mechanisms that one could potentially legitimately consider in a convention? As the convention gets together and says, all right, we need to limit power and jurisdiction of federal government. What powers and how? And how are we going to do it? So if your concern is runaway federal agencies, one of the ways one can constrain federal agencies are sunset provisions. It's just an example. I'm not proposing that. I'm not saying that's what we should do. I'm not saying that's what New Hampshire representatives to a convention should do. I'm just saying that is a kind of thing that one could consider. Because remember, that convention is a conversation of the representatives of all the 50 states or whoever shows up to that convention. You're going to discuss the issues, you're going to thrash them out, and you're going to propose potential amendments or decide, hey, there's nothing here for us to propose at all.
Representative Seibert, ranking member.
Yeah, I have a question in regards to rulings such as Citizens United. Even with the application, I'm having a very hard time seeing how we protect this process from influence from outside entities. I mean, one could say, I guess, that, here in the we're elected by the people, and so we would be good to go represent that. But, don't we see a lot of money flowing around here in Concord for certain pieces of legislation or on behalf of certain legislators to do certain things to appease those special interests? And I'm talking about, everybody up here. It's not just one side of the aisle, the other. So I guess what are the plans to protect, that further?
Well, there is
How do-
not a proposal under this particular resolution to deal with federal financing of elections. If one wanted to propose an amendment in that regard, and I think Wolfpack is pursuing a potential amendment in that arena, then there's an opportunity to bring that topic discussion to a convention. If you have the requisite 2/3 states agree, and thrash out an amendment proposal that would be considered as an amendment to the Constitution. It's not in this particular listing.
Follow up.
Thank you. I guess what I'm talking about is, say, a corporation paying a delegate to, put a certain subject or whatever that would benefit them in the end when that said delegate attends the article convention.
Delegates from a state are sent by the legislature, so they're picked by the legislature, whatever process it decides is appropriate, and sent with a particular point of view. So I'll go back to the Constitutional Convention. New York sent 3 delegates. They worked in that convention for a period of time. Two of them decided that what was being discussed was beyond the scope of what was their remit from the state, so they left. And Alexander Hamilton remained the only one there. So they didn't have the requisite authority anymore with only 1 delegate. So if you're asking, would the state send a delegate that is then being paid under the table by a corporation? I mean, that would seem to me a violation of the charter of a commissioner going to the commission.
Other questions for the prime? Representative Foss.
Thank you. I actually have a follow-up from Representative Belcher's question. So you used the example of the Commerce Clause and saying that obviously Congress has passed many laws based on their understanding of the Commerce Clause, and the Supreme Court has held these up as constitutional. So if a convention were to find that actually Congress doesn't have the authority to, I don't know if you'd rather regulate interstate commerce or regulate it in this manner, isn't this essentially creating a 4th branch of government?
No, it's not created. If in the example of interstate commerce, a convention strikes an amendment that brings the understanding of what regulating interstate commerce meant back to what the original purpose was back when the Constitution was created, what it means is the federal government is not going to have the authority to pass laws in that area. So the states then are given that authority. The authority comes back to the states to act on specific items and concerns.
Follow up.
But so that essentially would act on a check to laws that Congress has already passed, U.S. Congress, and that the judicial branch has found constitutional. So this is a check on them, similar to our system of checks and balances. So, but this would not create a 4th branch of government, you're saying? And I just don't understand, how wouldn't it, if it has this check and balance power?
So if you consider the check and balance being judicial, legislative, and executive, fine, but there's another check and balance, which is federalism, federal, state, local control. So if you take power away from the feds who have inappropriately taken it, and the court system said it's okay. Now you pass a constitutional amendment and say, no, you don't have that authority. That authority, as articulated in the 10th Amendment, goes back and stays with the states. So the state has the authority to act. It's not another branch of government. It's another layer of government.
Okay, one final follow-up.
But wouldn't that be a violation of the supremacy clause, that the federal government, the federal laws are the law of the land?
And the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And if the amendment says that the states have authority in this area, it's not a violation of the supremacy clause.
Other questions for the prime sponsor? Yes, go ahead, Representative Gagny.
Thank you for your indulgence. An Article 5 convention, is that not giving the people back the right for the laws to be for the people, by the people, and of the people, instead of the government overreach?
Absolutely. I second the motion.
Did I see a hand up? Representative Lloyd, please.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. So in this, if this were to go through, and let's say that this resolution does come through and an Article 5 convention is called, how does New Hampshire currently have a process in place for delegate selection?
I do not believe New Hampshire has a formalized process in place. That would have to be something the legislature would take up, and I would expect that it would be some kind of discussion between the speaker and the president of the Senate of how we're going to identify who those commissioner delegates would be.
Seeing no further hands, I want to thank the prime sponsor, Representative Bernardi. Wonderful civics discussion here for the folks here in the room and the hundreds watching and who will watch at home. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Representative Plant, would you check that sign up front? We're not on HB 264. Where if there is an HCR 3 sign, we can put that up. If not, we will just remove that sign. Fine. Okay, at this time, I do have, as I said, a good number of speaking requests, but I want to go to a gentleman who is a former United States Senator from Pennsylvania, former presidential candidate. Rick Santorum is in the House. And our custom here is maybe the case in the U.S. Senate is to try to avoid applause. But
I don't object to that.
Former Senator Santorum does not object. You've been to New Hampshire before, I believe, Senator. Welcome back. The senator has asked for 15 minutes, and I think given the distance you've traveled, we can do that. So welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it is truly an honor to be here before this committee and to be back in New Hampshire. I only wish that the committee treats me kinder than the voters of New Hampshire did in 2012. We got a lot of support, but not quite enough. It's great to be here, and I want to do my best to try to answer maybe even some of the questions that have been asked here. I just want to give you a little bit of a background as to how I got involved. And when I was asked about this issue, actually it was during the 2012 campaign, I knew nothing about it. I'm a lawyer. I was in Congress and the Senate for 16 years and knew nothing about Article 5 and really didn't even realize that state legislatures could propose amendments because it was nothing I'd ever heard before. And so my initial reaction was, as being a conservative, was, let's just say, very skeptical. Well, if it hadn't been done for 240 years, why are we thinking about doing it now? And so I really had the position of really not being a supporter of it. And it wasn't until later on, and I remind the committee that when I was running for president in 2011 here in New Hampshire and in 12, the federal deficit was federal debt was $14 trillion. I mean, that doesn't seem that long ago that I was up here campaigning and it was 14 trillion. It's 30, almost 35, $36 trillion now. Every 4 months, we're adding $1 trillion to the national debt. I just ask any of you, and I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, if we continue this, are we not headed to a fiscal crisis? And do you see anybody, either party, both parties are guilty here. Do you see either party doing anything in Washington, D.C. to stop the accumulation of debt and the collapse of our financial system? Does anyone believe that's not going to happen? Okay, I don't see any hands going up. So when people tell me, well, there's a risk if we do a convention of states. Well, if the alternative is fiscal collapse is a certainty, what's the risk? If your house across the street is burning and you have to cross the street to put the fire out, there's a risk of crossing the street. There is. Their car could be coming by. It could hit you. Bad things can happen if you cross the street. But if your house is burning, you cross the darn street. Ladies and gentlemen, you know all this. You know this. I mean, you're the live free or die state. You know that Washington is on a crash course, whether it's financially or whether it's the tyranny that we're seeing candidly from both parties when it comes to the president and the way they wield their pens and tell you how they're going to change everything and do things that presidents heretofore never thought they could do. This is not what we signed up for, if you will, in this Constitution. People talk about, they pull out their pocket Constitution, say, don't change this. Well, it was perfectly written. It was divinely inspired. We don't have any Madisons or Franklins or Jeffersons left in the United States. Well, we may not, but let's just be honest. This document has been changed. It's been changed 27 times. It may have been a perfect document. It was a darn good one. And I would argue that most people think most of the changes are pretty darn good. First 10 amendments, not too many people disagree with those, right? The amendments after the Civil War, not too many people disagree with those. In fact, someone asked the question, well, we don't follow the laws now. Why will we follow them in the future? Look at the amendments. We actually do follow those. We actually follow them pretty darn well. Do we not limit presidents to 2 terms? Yep, we follow that. Do women have the right to vote? Well, I look around here, I'd say the answer is yes. We follow those amendments. Why do we follow them? We follow them because it is darn near impossible to pass an amendment to the Constitution. It's the hardest thing any government, any level of government is required to do to pass anything. The hardest, highest bar is to add an amendment to the Constitution. You need 3/4 of the states. Imagine if you had to get 3/4 of the House here to pass anything. Oh, you'd name a park or two, but anything controversial, no way you're going to get 3/4 of it. And here's the interesting thing. Someone said, well, you only need 13 states for one house of legislature to oppose it. That's wrong. You need 13 states and one house of legislature to do nothing. They don't have to oppose it. They don't have to vote on it. What is the easiest thing? I know some of you are new members, but let me assure you the answer to this question. What is the easiest thing for any legislator to do when it comes to an issue? Nothing. Right? Put it in your drawer. All 13 houses of 13 different states have to do is put it in their drawer. This is darn near impossible. And so in order to pass something, you need broad consensus. If you look at all the amendments that have passed to date, they were overwhelming consensus that this needed to be done. You need 75% of the states. My guess is you need 85% of the public to agree to get 75% of the states to pass. You talk about a runaway convention. A convention simply does one thing. It proposes amendments. Tomorrow, the Congress could propose an amendment to eliminate the First Amendment. They can do it tomorrow. Do you see people running around saying, oh, I'm worried that Congress might propose an amendment that's going to take my rights away? Nobody worries about that. Why? Because it's damn near impossible to pass anything through the legislature. They knew they wouldn't get something like that passed. Do you think folks, after having worked hard to get 34 states to do the 3 things that Representative Bernardi, who did, by the way, a fabulous job, do you think After working that hard to get a convention, they're going to propose things that have no chance of passing? No, they're going to propose things that have some chance for states that may not be excited about the topics that are at hand might see a way to pass something. I use an example. People say, well, what would that be? Would it be a balanced budget amendment? Maybe. I doubt a balanced budget amendment, candidly, will pass 38 state legislatures at this point. I doubt it. In fact, I greatly doubt it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I don't think it will happen. Do you think, well, then what would happen? The one example I use that I still think could pass, and something that would be very important for the stability of our republic, is to limit the Supreme Court to 9 members. That would prohibit either party from packing the court and trying to do something which I think would be against the interests of our country. I know Democrats may say, well, that's because you have a majority now. Well, that hasn't always been the case. And let me assure you, it won't always be the case. It will swing back and forth, but it will do so gradually over time. And that is the way stability works for America. And I think 38 state legislatures could actually pass that. Would it be worth doing a convention of states just to do that? In my opinion, absolutely yes, for 3 reasons. Number one, the act alone of calling a convention. The founders, remember, had something in common. And people forget this, but it's true. The founders were state legislators. They didn't want the power in the federal government. They knew there needed to be more power, but they didn't want the power to go to the federal government. They wanted it at the states. So they were state legislators, and they focused on one thing. They focused on checks and balances, and particularly checking the federal government becoming a tyrannical body, because they were afraid of that. They came from that. And so they put all these checks in place to make sure that happened. They put 2 particular provisions in that Constitution to protect the states. One was mentioned earlier. You folks used to pick United States senators. Now, as someone who's a United States Senator from Pennsylvania who would never have been picked by my legislature, I'm actually glad that's not the case anymore. But the reality is, it was there so you had a body to check Washington, D.C. from taking your power. The Senate, just so you know, most folks don't know this, but prior to the 17th Amendment in 1912, in order to bring up a bill in the United States Senate, you know what percentage of senators had to agree to bring up a bill just to vote on it? 100%. Do you know what the federal deficit was in 1912 when the 17th Amendment was passed? $1.50 from the Spanish-American War. The federal government, Washington, D.C., was a backwater town that nobody paid much attention to. 17th Amendment came, changed everything. People say, don't touch this Constitution. It has been touched, ladies and gentlemen. It has been touched, and it's been fundamentally changed and shifted the power away from you to Washington. And Washington, D.C. exploded. Second thing that happened was court decisions during the New Deal primarily that expanded all of these provisions in the federal Constitution to allow an ever-expanding role of government, and that continues. This is not the same Constitution. People wave this around. If you order a Constitution from the General Printing Office in Washington, D.C., do you know how big it is? It's 2,600 pages. That is the Constitution you live by. When people say, don't touch it, it's been touched, folks. This is not 2,600 pages. But the Constitution you live by, which is annotated by Supreme Court decision and amendments, is 2,600 pages. Do you think we might be able to touch that? You think that might be a good idea? And so the reason it's important for you to have this call and to do this convention is to reassert your authority, because the second provision is the one we're talking about, was the provision to allow you to propose amendments. Everybody needs a boss. Everybody needs a check. You are the check to the federal government, and for 250 years, you haven't used it. For 130 years, you didn't need it. You had another check. It was the United States Senate. But for the last 100 years, you have not used the check that was the emergency check. And you can make the argument that up until the last 20 or so years, you didn't need that either. But you do now. You have an obligation because you have power. Spider-Man, right? You're Spider-Man. You have great power. You have great responsibility. I know state legislatures, you're used to being dumped upon by the federal government, everybody telling you how to do things, how to run things. There's one good way to stop it. A good slap aside the head. Hey, bye, we're the Bauer in town, with new sheriff. We're going to pass this resolution. We're going to assert our authority rightfully under the Constitution. There are going to be people who say, oh, this is, this under the Article 5 is part of the Constitution. Article 5 is your authority, your responsibility to protect this country. Don't shirk that responsibility because, oh, I'm afraid of a runaway. A runaway what? A runaway convention to propose amendments. Remember, Congress can do it today. So this proposes amendments. And by the way, as for the runaway, because I know that's an important issue, I'm running around, I'll be in South Dakota on Monday. We're going to probably pass South Dakota. It'll be the 20th state. So New Hampshire, you got to get cooking if you want to be 20. So South Dakota will probably pass it next week. We already passed the Senate by a big margin, should pass the House. We have to go around state by state by state to get 34 states to ratify this thing. And we're using the language that you have before you is the same language in South Dakota. It was the same in Georgia, which was the first state to pass this, and Arizona and Texas and Florida and a whole bunch of other states have already passed it. It's the same language. Well, why are we bothering to do that? Well, because the language, just like when you pass a bill, it has to be the same in the House and the same in the Senate, or it doesn't become law. Same thing here. It has to be the same in all 34 states, or you don't get a convention called. How do I know that? Because there's been 400 calls for a convention in the history of our country, and we've yet to have a convention. If all you needed was 34 states calling a convention and you can go and do anything, we'd already have a convention. But Congress has never called a convention. Why? Because 34 states haven't agreed on the subject matter that they all agree on to what? Limit the convention. I mean, it just makes sense. If you need 34 states to agree on what the convention's about, that obviously means something at the convention. They're limited by what the call of the convention is for. You had a bill earlier in this discussion talking about faithful delegate. That's a belt and suspender, as the gentleman appropriately said. That's to make sure that your state is following what you as the legislature want, which is limiting to those 3 topics, at least the ones we're talking about here, and maybe other things that you want to limit to, that they have to vote for this or can't vote for something of this. That's up to you. You control the process. People say, well, we don't know what the rules are. There's no rules set. Well, the reality is there's precedent. I don't know about you, but most legislatures, when they come into session, have to adopt rules. You guys have to adopt rules when you come into session? Okay, well, how do you know what rules to adopt? How do you know what process to use? You have a precedent that when you come in, you do certain things, not in the rules, because you don't have any rules, but you have precedent as to how things are done, and you operate by precedent all the time. Well, as was mentioned, there's been 40 conventions of states in the history of our country, and they've all run the same way. There is precedent. There is one state, one vote. How do we know? Because we've had 40 of them, and they've all been one state, one vote. Just like you, before you adopt your rules, that precedent will rule until you have a rules, and then you could change that at the rules. Good luck. There's about 3 times more small states than there are big states as population. You think they're going to give up power to the big states? Let me assure you, New Hampshire's not going to do that. Neither is South Dakota. I know there's a lot of panic around this, and I get it, because with uncertainty and unfamiliarity, people get nervous and they feel like, oh, there's risk. I'm here to try to get you comfortable that this is not a risky thing to do. And in fact, it is an absolutely necessary thing. And it's an absolute abandonment of your responsibility as legislators not to intercede and do an intervention on both parties in Washington, D.C. We need you. And particularly New Hampshire. It's one of the reasons I was so excited to come up here. You folks want to be first in the nation, and you are. You guys want to lead. You want to be the ones who have a oversized weight on what's going on in Washington, D.C. And here, I'm up here pleading with you to do that here. I would think New Hampshire would have been first. Live free or die. Protect our rights as the state. Why aren't you the first to be out here? Both parties. I don't get it. So educate me. Be happy to take your questions. Yes.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I do want to say that New Hampshire was ninth to approve the original Constitution, which put us over the top. So we perhaps will put you over the top with this, and time will
Pennsylvania
tell.
was second, but I'm just saying.
Time will tell. And I do want to say that when you did lose the New Hampshire primary in 2012, you lost to a gentleman who had a place on Lake Winnipesaukee.
I know very well.
So there's that. So I see Representative Mandelbaum, our clerk. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Santorum, for being here and taking my question. So I'm curious what potential legal challenges there might be to an amendment that is passed by a convention.
Okay, so again, the convention proposes amendments. We don't pass. They don't pass it, and all 50 states gather together. Each state gets one vote. 26 votes are necessary for an amendment to be proposed. It is then, according to the Constitution, sent to the states for ratification. All but of the 27 amendments, 26 were done by the state legislatures themselves, having to pass it both houses, and in the case of Nebraska, one house. And once it is adopted, just like all the prior 27, once it's adopted, it's included in the Constitution, and therefore has the same force as any other provision of the Constitution. So, the court will then go ahead and interpret what that means. But if the court is limited to 9 members, there's not much interpretation there. I mean, again, it depends on the amendment, but at least the one I'm suggesting would not leave itself very much open to interpretation.
Thank you.
Other questions, Representative Foss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Santorum.
Thank you.
I'll echo Chairman Moffett. Welcome back to New Hampshire,
Thank you.
and you should come here when it's not winter sometime.
I have.
Oh, good. Glad to hear it. The examples that have been talked about are generally, or the examples that have been used, limiting the power of the federal government. But is there the check to do something like expanding the power? Like I say Chevron deference was just overturned, which, I mean, it's been a minute since I took administrative law in Pennsylvania, and it seems like kind of threw the administrative law world into a tizzy, let's say. So what's to stop a convention from proposing an amendment that would reinstate something like Chevron deference, that administrative agencies have the power to, essentially make laws? Are we the only check there?
No, again, as mentioned before, the language of the resolution would limit what is eligible to be proposed. Wolfpack wants to have campaign finance. Well, you can't, if that happens, if there's a convention on campaign finance limiting the spending in Washington, you can't have an abortion amendment be proposed. It's non-germane. And so that would be ruled out of order, number one. Number two, if you look at the fact that these states, 34 of them, came together because they wanted to limit the power of the federal government, at least 34 of those states are probably going to vote for things that limit the power of the federal government, not expand it. I mean, that would be a rational thing to say, because at the time that 34 is accomplished, 34 states still have to be controlled by people who agree with this. Otherwise, like I know is being considered here, it would be rescinded, and then you wouldn't get to 34.
One follow-up.
Thank you. But there's nothing to, so should this happen in an Article 5 convention be held, there's nothing to stop me from introducing another resolution that would propose an amendment to enshrine abortion, affirmative right to abortion in the Constitution. So,
So-
there's no stopgap there. It seems like this would set quite the precedent.
Well, any delegate could come forward and obviously they have the right to say anything and propose anything. But that doesn't mean that you have the right to propose all sorts of things here in the legislature, and that doesn't mean it's going to pass. And in this case, it will not be it will not be considered. It would be considered out of order because it's not germane to the subject matter of the convention, and so it would be dismissed for that reason. I think it would also probably fail because there wouldn't be sufficient votes for it to happen. But by order of like I said, if you need 34 states to come together and agree on the exact language, that language has meaning. And the meaning is that the convention is limited to those things. And so anything that is outside the scope of that would be considered out of order and not be eligible to vote. And then we mentioned before, and you have here the faithful delegate bill, you would be an unfaithful delegate if New Hampshire would pass a law that said that you have to limit the areas of discussion to the things that are in the call for the convention, and you don't do so, then you'd be in violation of that. That's one of the reasons I'm supporting the faithful delegate bill. And I think mentioned before, about half the states have already passed something like that because they don't want people going to these conventions that are limited to certain things and introducing other issues. They want to keep it to the subject matter because that's what they promised the people they would do when they passed it. You know, when you make a vote, it's a promise. You're saying to the people of the state, this is what we're going to do. We promise that we will uphold the language, the resolution, or the statute that we passed, and you would be violating that, and you would be subject to penalties as a result, as an individual delegate.
The questions, Representative Seibert.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to your example there that you had in regards to, like, say the topic is campaign finance. Could you actually underneath that, because it is still under campaign finance, say, like, as you were like, do, campaign finance for pro-choice or something like that?
Again, I'm not advocating for campaign finance.
No, I understand that.
So
but I'm just.
So I'm not an expert on what, I don't even know what their language says specifically. So I really can't answer that question. I can tell you with respect to the language we have, they're all very clear as they're limiting. It's limiting language. It's to reduce the power of the federal government. It's not to expand the power of the federal government. And so that's how our language works. I can't speak to theirs.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Representative Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for taking my question.
Thank you.
Can
Hope you're feeling better.
Can you understand a little bit of my can you understand a little bit of my concern here in that New Hampshire does not have a defined delegate selection process, and how I'm concerned with this potentially having a very partisan slant should this be taken up and come to pass. To use your example of the Supreme Court situation, couldn't a delegate also create or use a convention to force a hearing for a Supreme Court appointee to happen in a timely manner, when it's proposed by the sitting president? I mean, like, there's a lot of partisan slant to this, and I guess my concern would be the delegate selection process and making sure that every voice is represented.
Yeah, about a dozen states have passed delegate selection procedures, and all of them, the legislatures basically determine who the folks are. And I would, our expectation is, and I think most people's expectation is, that the legislature would appoint legislators. Now, there may be some people outside the legislature that could be appointed, but by and large, we suspect that legislatures, seeing this as their responsibility, would put some of their colleagues forward. And as far as the partisan breakup, I mean, every state's going to be different as to how they do that, and the numbers. Some states have I think 7 or 8. Some have 6. Some have 5. I mean, they're all over the place as far as the number is concerned. But it is the decision by you, and you as a legislator will have the opportunity to weigh in on that and try to influence how that process works. Again, you folks control the whole process.
Other questions, Representative Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator, thank you so much for being here. Welcome back to New Hampshire.
Thank you. It's
You're
great
always a
to be
wealth of
here.
information.
Thank you.
And mine is a simple question. The one vote concept, that's great for New Hampshire, but wouldn't California and New York and so on say that's not full representation?
Well, I just go back. I mean, you mentioned California. California has been involved with conventions of states in the past. The Colorado River Compact, which allocates water for the Colorado River, was done through a convention of states. Each state passed a resolution to appoint commissioners. All the states involved appointed commissioners. They were sent. They each had commissioners come, more than one. They all gathered together. They came up with an idea and then went back to the states. California didn't complain. They had one vote and Utah had one vote. Why? Because if you look at the language, I mean, it's a convention of states. It's not a convention. It's not a delegate convention. It's a convention of states. Each state is a sovereign entity. And so they may complain about it. But as I mentioned before, the precedent is one state, one vote. That's how it would begin. There would be a rules package that would be adopted. And maybe California and New York would say, well, we want, states to be the votes to be based on population. Well, there'd be about 38 or 39 states that would say no, because they would be at a disadvantage. There are only a handful of states that have huge populations, and they are not going to, I guarantee you, none of the small states are going to give up that privilege.
Other questions?
Thank you, Senator.
Representative Bennett.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm kind of new, so
welcome.
Thank you for coming here. I'm just curious about your timetable. Like, I know you can't pinpoint who's going to do what, but I'm sure you have a projection of, how you think this is going to play out. So I just wondering, like, are you thinking a year, 2 years? Like,
Yeah, I wish I was that smart. One of the things I've learned a long time ago is projecting how state legislatures are going to behave is really a risky business. I don't think you'll see anybody at Caesars putting odds up on things like that. I mean, there are several states. I mentioned South Dakota. I mean, South Dakota, you would have thought was a state that would have passed this a long, long time ago, and Wisconsin passed it. I mean, Wisconsin's, a very, very purple state, and yet it passed it, and some of the reddest states have not. And so it's a hard thing to figure. The answer is it's not going to be this in the next couple of years, and unlikely to be the next 3 or 4 years. But it's going to take. I hate to say it, things have to continue to keep getting worse. And the worse it gets, the more people are saying, okay, really don't have a choice here. We've got to do something. We need an intervention. And I think we're going to pick up, at least I'm very hopeful, we'll pick up 3 or 4 states this year. And hopefully that'll build some momentum.
Any other questions? Representative Belcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Senator, for being here.
Thank you.
You made a good case. I think I am somewhat swayed, but I do have a little bit of a question.
Yeah.
You made the case that we're heading for a real fiscal crisis. I don't disagree. You also made the case that it's very unlikely that a balanced budget amendment would be able to make it through given the constraints that exist under Article 5. I also don't disagree. So given that, is there a reason that we ought to look at the Article 5 process rather than, say, the process outlined by Madison, nullification and interposition?
Yeah, look, first off, nullification has been debated and lost, and we fought a war over it, and it didn't go very well for the nullifiers. I don't think that's a path that is going to be a fruitful path for resolving the problems that we have today. And I mentioned before, one of the biggest reasons I am personally for this is just doing it. Even if nothing happens, even if you don't You've proposed amendments and none of them are ratified. What you've done is you've told the Congress and the president there's a sheriff in town, that you guys actually are willing to use the power given to you to draw. Imagine, I think people don't realize how much of a deal this would be. We've never done this in the history of the country. Can you imagine the attention nationally this will get? This will be a huge deal. This will be covered wall to wall. There'll be all sorts of attention on what? Federalism, the role of the states when it comes to the federal government, where power should be allocated, where is it best placed? There'll be movements behind different amendments. Will there be money behind it? Sure, I'm sure there'll be money behind, but there'll be money behind good things and probably bad things, things you agree with and things you don't. There's always money involved. Why? Because there's power involved. There's power involved, money's going to be involved. But it's all going to be, the beauty of this will be out in the open. It'll be a transparent process. There'll be a national debate, and you folks will be at the center of it, not Congress, not Washington. You folks will be educating the American public about federalism, about what imagine if our kids in school had to actually learn what the Constitution said, right? And we had a national discussion about what Washington should do and what's best left at the state or what's best left to the people. That in itself, that educational process and that new sheriff in town process tells me more than anything else. Look, I served in Washington. There is absolutely no governor on what every member of Congress, I don't care how conservative you are, you get there and you got people in your office, you know this. How many people in your office come here and say, I wish you'd do less of this, or don't spend as much money on this? Nobody does. Nobody does in Concord, and let me assure you, nobody does in Washington. And they ask us to do things that we have no constitutional authority to do, but we don't want to say no. This changes the game, because once you do it and once all the fears are swept away, that it runs orderly and you propose amendments, maybe some pass, maybe they don't, guess what you can do? Congress gets out of line again or doesn't start addressing the issues you address. You say, you know what, we're coming back. You are supposed to be a player on the national scene. I can't stress that enough. Why? Because you are closest to the people. There is nobody closer to the people than you. 400 of you, immeasurably close to the people. And we need you in Washington.
Thank you, Senator. Seeing no other hands up, I do want to thank you again, former U.S. Senator. We don't get that many in here. Our new governor, by the way, is a former U.S. Senator.
Oh, I know. I served with her, yes.
And before we lose you, as a senator from Pennsylvania,
and by the way, she has Pennsylvania ties. We're very proud of that as a Penn Stater. So
she was a Keystone State resident at one time as a student. As a former U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, did you go to the Steelers or the Eagles?
I'm a Western Pennsylvania guy, so that should probably answer your question. So I'm okay. But I root for the Eagles because I represented Philadelphia, so I'm for them to for the Super Bowl.
Well, the Eagles did beat the Patriots one year, but we need to move on. Thank you so much, Senator, for your time.
Pleasure.
Okay, we have 15 cards. We're going to let everyone have time to speak. We're going to have to. By the reality of time, limit subsequent speakers to 2 minutes or less. Our Vice Chair, Representative Rollins, when you are coming up on 2 minutes, will wave his hat or give you a signal because we want to let everyone have a chance to speak. 15 seconds before he'll give you the high. So some of you have only asked for a minute, and that's fine. So we're going to have to do that to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. So let's go right to Representative Ullery. Is Representative Ullery still here? Yes, he is.
Nowhere near as eloquent, and I'll be much more brief. In listening to the testimony thus far, there appears to be some confusion. HB 264 regulates the delegates to a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments. It does not establish or have any other except restrictionary on who is a delegate. Delegate selection is made by the body. That is the general court in New Hampshire. It may be the legislature in Nebraska or Kansas, whichever has the unicameral one, or the two bodies meeting together in joint convention in most cases, and for most applications, standard state compacts. A convention of states is not another form of government. It is only a convention to propose substantially similar proposals. For example, you have a soccer game. If you have a soccer game, you could bring a black and white ball. You could bring a yellow and black ball. You could bring a yellow and white ball. But you're bringing a soccer ball. You bring a football. You're not, unless you're playing Australian rules, and we're not in Australia. You're not going to be able to play in that game because you brought a football to a soccer game, which is why the purpose of establishing a convention is made by the legislature. The miracle of Article 5 is that there is a method for Congress, big government, to propose amendments, and for the other 1/3 of the federalism, that is the state governments, which are directly elected by the people, to propose amendments to the foundation document. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I'm not going to ask if anybody wants to ask a question. If any rep or any member of the committee wants to ask a question, go ahead and sound off. If you have a salient, important question, please do. Otherwise, we will try to let everybody have a chance to weigh in. Representative Timothy Horrigan is here. He opposes the bill. Welcome, Representative Horrigan. He opposes the resolution, HCR 3. It's not a bill.
Yes. So I'm Representative Timothy Horrigan from Stratford County District 10. So it's Senator Santorum. That's a hard act to follow. I've never been a U.S. senator or run for president or been a CNN commentator. So I'm not quite as polished as he is, and probably not even as polished as Representative Ullery. So I mostly came here this morning to speak in favor of the next bill, but this is a flip side of the same thing. So I think an Article 5 constitutional convention is a bad idea. I mean, it probably doesn't sound as bad given the chaos in Washington, D.C. It's better. It's probably better than trying to amend the Constitution by have the president signing executive orders. But it's a bad idea, and as written, this convention would inevitably run away because its scope is so broad. Just about everything is related to something that's in that. And we're talking about the delegate selection process. That's actually not for the states to determine. The Congress will pass an enabling act. They've never needed to send one to the president's desk, but some have been considered in the past, and they've always there's a good possibility they might have a direct election of the delegates. And certainly the delegates would have the same rights as members of Congress. This convention would essentially be a third branch of a third chamber of Congress. So they would have the same rights that U.S. representative senators do. And that does not extend to the state being able to recall them if they vote the wrong way. And
thank you, Representative. And we look forward to hearing you speak to the next measure.
Yeah.
Once we get through this one.
Yeah, I have a hard stop at 12:30, so we may not get through them all. But if everybody keeps it to 2 minutes, like I've just failed to do, I guess we'll be there by about noon. So thanks.
Honorable Scott Wallace, former representative, is in the House. Welcome back, Representative Wallace, who supports the measure.
Thank you, Chairman Moffett, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Scott Wallace, representing myself from the town of Danville. I'll read a little bit faster considering the time constraints. HCR 3 deserves your support. An Article 5 convention is the people's way to amend the U.S. Constitution when a runaway Congress will not do its constitutional duty. Historically, Congress has refused to heal itself unless and until the people have made their discontent plain by aggregating sufficient support for amending the U.S. Constitution. This is most effectively done by the aggregation of Article 5 petitions from the several states. I suggest that the people of New Hampshire and the United States spoke loud and clear of their desires to rein in a runaway federal leviathan by their choices at the ballot boxes last November. The federal government uses unfunded mandates to effectively control state legislatures, local governments, and we the people. They insert themselves into America's most personal decisions, and they have destroyed our nation's fiscal security. New Hampshire has a balanced budget amendment petition waiting to be acted upon. We are all well aware that the impending debt crisis is a sword of Damocles hanging over taxpayers' heads. It's time to bring their tyranny to an end, and a convention of states is the way to do it. We have long talked about the split between the establishment politics and agitators. The agitators unseated former House Speaker McCarthy by supporting Mike Johnson, giving the establishment a painful lesson. Agitators will only be ignored for so long. The American voters have just delivered part 2 of this lesson to the dumbstruck political establishment for both parties. Part 2 is simple. The class of agitators is much larger than you thought. We consist of working class Americans across the nations, and our patience has run out. Both parties are scrambling to figure out what the wave of populism means for the future and what adjustments must be made in light of the new political realities. Let's be honest, District of Columbia politicians are more DC politicians than anything else. The chances are extremely high they'll get it wrong if they get it at all. Here amongst the grassroots is how elected officials in both the states and the federal government can get it right, and why we must not get it wrong. The American people want their power back. Passing HCR 3 would be a step in that direction. Mason had it right when he included a way for the people to reassert control of the federal government. We know New Hampshire's people no longer trust their government at the federal level. We want to govern ourselves again at the state and local level. We are tired of watching a money-gobbling District of Columbia machine crank out policies that don't work, don't help, and don't line up with what the Constitution says the federal government should and should not be doing.
Thank you, Senator. I'm supposed to senators. Thank you, former Representative Wallace. We need to move on.
Understood. I'll be happy to take any questions.
As I said earlier, if anybody has a question that screams to be asked, please do.
I've been pushing this for a dozen years and formally the prime sponsor of this resolution and faithful delegate 2 or 3 times historically in the last decade. So I'm pretty well read on this subject.
Yes, former Representative Wallace is a resource. He's been involved with this before. He's been here before. Okay. Speaking of senators, we have another former senator, former state senator, who's asked for 1 minute. Welcome back, Senator Jim Rubens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Jim Rubens, formerly state senator from District 5, and also a board member and war room director of the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation. We're the leading national organization seeking a single subject fiscal responsibility amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And we speak on behalf of the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation in wholehearted support of this resolution, the COS resolution. It's going to differ with Senator Santorum in 2 places. Modest difference because we wholeheartedly support this resolution. Number 1, it would likely be deemed germane should a proposal come up to the floor of an amending convention on the subject of limitation on federal power, a proposal to allow state limitations on campaign money. I also serve on the board of American Promise, the leading organization seeking a congressionally drafted campaign money limits bill. So again, right now, the Supreme Court has ruled that the states do not have power to limit campaign money in most places, except for direct contributions to candidates. We perceive that that would be deemed germane on the floor of an amending convention under the limitations of federal power. Second, I think a fiscal responsibility amendment would pass. It's supported by supermajorities of voters of all political persuasions, left and right. Everyone knows we've got a fiscal problem in our government. The polling shows this. And while a balanced budget amendment might not pass, a more flexible fiscal responsibility amendment that allows for the growth of the government, et cetera, would likely pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Sam Fieldman is still here in the House. Welcome back, Sam. Mr. Fieldman, you have a minute or two.
Thank you, Chairman Moffett, representative of the committees. I'm here as a volunteer with Wolfpack, and I'm testifying neutral on this resolution. You should pass or reject it based on your view of the policies that it advocates, not based on the Article 5 convention procedure itself. I want to offer myself up to the committee as one of the leading experts in the country on the convention process to help you understand that aspect of it. There are multiple protections in this process. There's roles to be played with the federalism and separation of powers system designed by our founders, roles to be played for the Congress, the courts, the states, and the delegates. Each one of those have interplay between them, creating numerous protections over this process, ones beyond those that were originally explicitly written in, such as the ratification of 3/4. And specifically as an example, I want to speak to some of the things that have been brought up by Representative Siebert and Representative Lloyd. When in terms of delegate selection and regulations over them, when there was a ratification convention for the 21st Amendment, none of the states had bills in place to choose their delegates to those ratification conventions. Those were all passed very quickly. The whole process went off very easily. It would be better if states did that in advance, which is why I advocated for such a bill that this committee and the House passed last year. And I hope that the full body will pass that soon. But even without that, that is still in place. In addition, the delegates, when they're chosen for a specific purpose, that does help add an additional level of protection that they will serve for that purpose. It is an extra protection when that purpose is campaign finance, which is a protection that you get with the resolution that Wolfpack advocates for, which is not in place here. Then campaign finance violations tend to hurt those people rather than help, but it is still a protection that it's a single subject.
And thank you for speaking to Representative Seibert, Representative Lloyd's question. I have a quick one for you before you step away. 21st Amendment rescinded the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition one.
Yes.
Was there a movement for a convention of the states that led to the 21st Amendment that maybe, can you speak to that real quick, or do you know?
Yes. There was an effort to get an Article 5 convention for that purpose. It was not a significant part of it, but it was. I advocated pretty well. There was at one point the representative in New York who got it passed in New York got a standing ovation when it was. When they voted in favor of it, because the people were so in favor of it. But ultimately, there was the way that got passed was through a massive organizing effort, primarily from a group called the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. And Wolfpack has learned a tremendous amount from that organization's history in terms of how we're redesigning our approach in trying to get the amendment through the use of the convention process as well as other tools.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joshua Skinner from Farmington is here, and he supports the measure, the House concurrent resolution.
Good morning, Chairman Moffett. Good morning, committee. My name is Joshua Skinner. I'm a proud native of New Hampshire and a disabled Army combat veteran. I'm here today to testify in support of Article 5 of the Convention of States, because I swore an oath to the whole Constitution and everything in it. These words set the standard for liberty and freedom around the world. A government instituted among men derives its power by the consent of the people to be governed. It's a contract that the government shall preserve and enforce the rights afforded to we the people of the United States. The Declaration of Independence clearly states that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter, abolish it, and institute new government. These words set the standard for liberty and freedom around the world. These words filled me with a pride and courage when I shipped off to Afghanistan to defend the country, defend the nation in a time of need at the age of 18. It's a circumvention and disregard for the Constitution and corruption within our government that is a problem and my concern. The American people deserve better. So do the families of those that gave the ultimate sacrifice for this nation. My brothers and sisters in the arms that fought and bled for 2 decades just to witness the abomination of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We deserve a government that isn't so out of touch and responds to the people. I support Article 5 Convention of States because it gives we the people a way to stifle this long to encroaching tyranny. It gives more power back to the states and the people, and will be a giant step in the right direction. The authors of our Constitution knew all too well of the dangers of the government obtaining too much power and that the people needed a recourse of action. If this should arise in the future, Article 5 was the only amendment that was unanimously adopted by the authors. Some of you served in the military, and you also took the same oath I did to our Constitution. So once again, do we take an oath to our Constitution with everything in it, or do we just pick and choose what amendments that we support? We, the people that are already aware, they understand Article 5, want it, and we are asking for you to pass this to the floor for an honest vote. We are simply exercising our constitutional right to process amendments to this existing Constitution and that are aimed to benefit the American people. The common fear-mongering of a runaway convention are absurd and just can't happen. Article 5 is a limited convention of the states to only propose amendments to this existing Constitution. At the convention, only the topics that are on the applications are subject to discussion. Anything outside the scope of these 3 topics is out of order.
Thank you for that. We need to move on. The points you just made, we've heard before, but thank you for emphasizing those. And also, thank you not only for your words, but for your service. This is the House Committee on State Federal Relations and Veterans Affairs. So thank you for being here and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Nathan Marston from Chichester supports the HCR 3. Welcome.
My name is Nathan Marston and I live in the town of Chichester. I'm here today to express my deep concern for this nation's future. Our federal government has gone out of control and if not corrected will soon end in failure. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution is the only process to fix this problem. Article 5 allows the states to propose amendments that will limit government overreach, federal debt, and impose term limits on Congress. When the Constitution was written, elected officials were expected to be general citizens who would represent their communities. Over time, Congress has become a place to make a career rather than to serve the people. Additionally, the Constitution was formed with the idea of many small bodies of government. However, the federal government constantly takes power away from the states. Furthermore, the national debt has scaled to a staggering $36 trillion, climbing at a rate of $1 million every 20 seconds. If broken down by state, New Hampshire alone would owe $728.4 billion. Daniel Webster stated, "There's no nation on earth powerful enough to accomplish our overthrow. Our destruction, should it come at all, will be from another quarter, from the inattention of the people to the concerns of their government, from their carelessness and negligence." He referred to the government as the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. It is time that we the people make Washington answer to us. Our founding fathers knew that the federal government would grow too large and eventually no longer care about its residents. That is why they gave us Article 5, so we could prevent it from becoming tyrannical.
Thank you so much for that. Right on time. Bob Hanson, Mr. Hanson was here earlier. He's still here. Yes. Welcome back. If you can take a couple minutes, Mr. Hanson, from Salem.
Something large. I'll pass this around for copies afterwards.
Excellent.
All right. I was going to change. I was going to talk about because I think there's a big education process that took place today. The Constitution is very well organized, and the first 4,000 words talk about the structure of the government, the Senate, the House, the President, the Supreme Court. Then we get down to Article 5. Article 5 is only one sentence long. It's the only part of the Constitution where the state legislature is referred to. And I would ask you people after today, go home tonight, go home this weekend, find the Constitution. Down to Article 5 and put your finger on it where it talks about the state legislature. You have a duty, you have the authority to do something that totally bypasses Congress. we're going through the committee. It's expected that this bill is going to be voted on by the entire House and by the entire Senate. We're going to have to go through the Senate also. But I just ask you to go through, put your finger on it, get your spouse together, get your child, get your children, and say, look at this. The founding fathers had trust in me. I'm that person on the Constitution. They're putting their trust and confidence in me that I'm going to follow through when we have to break the glass for the emergency. It's time to do it. So I'd ask you all to pass this resolution and take care of your duty. One other thing, I'm the Veterans Coalition Director for the Convention of States in New Hampshire. Joshua Skinner was up here earlier. He's one of about 1,800 veterans that are also supporting this movement. Thank you for your time.
And you're a veteran, it sounds like.
Yes, my father and my grandfather were both Navy veterans. I enlisted in the Navy in the Vietnam era. I took the same oath as you did. In there it said support, defend the Constitution. That's why I got involved. I started saying, what can I do? I'm really upset with what happened. I went through the Constitution. I couldn't find anything where I could do it as an individual other than vote. And the section on the legislators being able to propose amendments opened up my eyes, and that's how I got involved in this.
Thank you for your testimony and thank you for your service.
What do I give this to?
Carol Petrusewicz is back. She'd asked for 3 minutes and 42 seconds. She'd asked for 56 seconds earlier. Obviously, you've timed yourself out. If you can time that down slightly, that would be great. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. We all agree that civics education is lacking in America. As you have demonstrated your love of country when you raised and spent your own money on your campaign and gave of your time to knock doors and have meetings with your constituents to get elected, you now have the opportunity to live up to your great character. By passing HCR 3, you're providing Americans an opportunity to get caught up with their civic education. Once 34 resolutions are passed, all citizens, young and old alike, will bear witness to history in the making. They will learn firsthand, starting with your leadership, how checks and balances work within our constitutional republic, vertical and horizontal. When your constituents see how much you do care for them, that you are willing to use the most powerful check and balance, Article 5, and you are willing to defend their unenumerated, inalienable rights, they too will receive that transfer of civics education. They will know what you knew when you passed HCR 3, that Article 5 is the only way to return the federal government to its jurisdictional lane. I gave you guys a packet, and it's very information to help support you and your constituents. Feel free to share it with your seatmates in Legislative Hall and with your senator friends across the aisle. And if you need any more, don't hesitate to ask. The first one is about the map of the 19 states that have passed the exact resolution that you're looking at today. It shows the people that voted. And you can see that it's evidence of the nonpartisan support. This information supports that what you are living up to your constituents' expectations, shown at the last presidential election. The people don't want a party. They want apolitical, all-American policy that benefits everyone. Next is the double-sided document showing those 42 interstate conventions. And it's showing the evidence of why the founders did not write the how-tos of all the details of Article 5, just like they didn't write the how-tos on the trial by juries. They knew how to run interstate conventions, just like we know how to run them today. There's some court cases, so you can see how that's been all worked out with how the usage of Article 5 is. And then there, of course, is the history of the calls and commissions of the original Constitutional Convention of 1787. And of course, as a bonus, I gave you an outline of the Constitution at a glance, because that's helpful to keep on hand. Thank you for always remembering that United, as a New Hampshire legislator, your only function is to protect and defend your constituents' unenumerated, inalienable rights. Passing HCR 3 is one way to fulfill that mission. I look forward to the fruits of any proposals returning to the Wordsmithing Convention for your ratification. And I'm grateful that the hope HCR 3 provides will not only restore the structural boundaries of the federal government for me and my posterity, but also increase your power to do greater good for New Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very organized testimony and for the handouts. And I appreciate your reference to civics education. I think this whole hearing has been, I think, a wonderful civics lesson for the many people that are watching and who will watch. Okay, Margaret Tully. Welcome, Margaret. Ms. Tully from Manchester, correct?
Correct.
Supporting the measure?
Yes. And today, what I'd like to talk about is the character of the people today, and can it measure up to the founders and the framers of the Constitution? And the greatest people in the world have all risen from humble beginnings. And we have Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln's father had no idea that Abraham Lincoln would be Abraham Lincoln, nor did Susan B. Anthony's mother expect her to be Susan B. Anthony, or Martin Luther King's father or mother expect them to be so great. So I don't want anybody to say that the character of the people today aren't what the character used to be. And the second thing I'd like to talk about is the ultimate sacrifice. And when all of us are stepping up in order to do great things, one of them is the veterans. And whenever we pass a grave, there's, the flags flying over there, or, placed on that grave. And they gave the ultimate sacrifice, and they didn't pick and choose what part of the Constitution they were going to endorse. And I think that's a very precedent to as we go forward. And the other thing that I want to talk about, which is something that just recently happened, is we don't know who's going to come into the world and change the world. And I really want to talk about a bishop, he's an archbishop, Fulton Sheen, and he died in 1979, and he was a bishop out of New York, and he had a television show. I don't know if everybody remembers who he is, but I grew up with him, and recently he has been on his way to sainthood. And with that, you have your first miracle, and there's 3 miracles that you have to do to become a saint. So the first miracle was a baby born in Southern Illinois, which is where he was from. And with that, the baby was born stillborn, or the umbilical cord was around her neck. There's a couple of different stories, but the baby was 61 minutes dead, and it came back to life. And so that is what made him become going past the first thing of a saint. So I just want to say, and that's in our, we remember who he is. So I just want to say, we just don't know who's coming down the path, who's going to change the world, or who's going to be the next saint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Representative Gagny and I remember Bishop Cardinal Fulton Sheen for sure. Yes. Paul Carey. Go ahead. Yeah, clarifying question from the clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ms. Tully. Could you just clarify how you spell your first name? Thank you.
And Paul, Paul, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Carey, like Drew, not Jim. Jim has 2 R's. Anyway, I appreciate the time here this morning. You've heard a lot of civic information and education, which redacted most of my document. But anyway, I'm going to speak on the 3 items that are in the HCR 3. And that's the number 1 for me, term limits for Congress and federal employees. I'm going to give 3 anecdotes real quick. On January 3rd, 2025, Senator Mitch McConnell was starting his 40th year in the Senate, Republican from Kentucky. Likewise, Democrat from California, former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, was starting her 40th year in Congress. And not to mention the federal bureaucracy, Dr. Anthony Fauci joined the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in 1974. Okay. He was promoted to director in 1984. Might not mean anything to anybody, but it seems like there's a lot of entrenchment in Washington, D.C. One of the things that I tried to do for my local town is we have citizens petitions. We're an SB2 town in Sandown, is where I live. And I put forward a petition warrant article to have the little town of Sandown urge the legislature to urge the Congress to accept the Article 5 Convention of States. And this was before Resolution HCR 3 was put forward. So it's really apropos. And tomorrow is our deliberative session for those that know about SB2. And so
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. Senator Rubens is here, and he's sitting right behind you to your left. And I believe he's the prime mover behind the establishment of SB2. So if you like it, you can thank him.
Okay.
And if you don't like it, you can talk to him. But
the huge ballots are a problem, but whatever, it is what it is. Anyway,
thank you. I'll give you another minute.
Okay, so we'll have our deliberative session. I have a presentation. I also brought these from the national organization. These are pocket guides to the Article 5. I brought 15 of them. If anybody, I actually brought 15, but I had Senator Santorum sign one. He's in the book. So if anybody wants one, I'd be happy to give one. I have a presentation tomorrow in Sandown, but most of what I have written down was said. Lastly, and you stole my thunder, Mr. Chairman, New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, which made it in force for the first 9 states. I'd like New Hampshire to be a part of this historical decision.
Which you heard me say to Senator Santorum.
Correct.
So you were listening. Thank you so much, Paul,
anybody want one?
for your testimony. Okay, we still have 4 more cards. Linda Curran from Londonderry. Linda, welcome. Has some written testimony according to your card, and she supports the measure.
Yes, my name is Linda Curran. I'm the state grassroots coordinator for Convention of States, and I'm from Londonderry. Most of what I was prepared today has already been covered. So I'd just like to say that I believe that as citizens, we have a duty to course correct the shortcomings now observed in the federal government. And as our representatives, we pass that duty on to you. We ask that you vote favorably on a resolution that will allow delegates from New Hampshire to participate in a 50-state conversation on how we can amend the Constitution to rein in the federal government's overreach, restrain it financially, and enact term limits wherever they may be warranted. We respectfully request that you pass HCR 3 out of committee for a full vote of the House and let all the voices in New Hampshire be heard.
And we just heard your voice, and thank you so much for coming up here
Thank you for having
from
me.
Londonderry. Also supporting the bill is John Luce from the beautiful town of Hancock. Route 202 goes through Hancock. Is that close to there, or
Sorry?
Route 202? Is that?
Yeah, it's close. Definitely. Yeah. Peterborough, that general area. Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here. Thank you, Chairman Moffett and everyone present, and appreciate your patience. I'm trying to avoid repeating because I'm sure you've been hearing many of the same points over and over. My name's John Luce. I'm a volunteer. I'm now the director of Convention of States Action in New Hampshire. And I do not claim to be an expert on this topic. I am pretty passionate about the topic, and I'm cramming like I'm expecting a big exam tomorrow to be able to learn more and more about this. This has been a great civics lesson. So I want to just begin by reading what the late Senator Tom Coburn, who was a big supporter of Convention of States, said. And he, by the way, was somebody who reached across the aisle. He had friends on each side of the aisle. If there's one thing that Americans have always agreed on, it's that government functions best when decisions are made closest to the people. And he says, only through a convention of states may the clear, unfettered voice of the people be heard and overreaching government be reined in. So you all are the closest to the people. And one of the reasons why I think this is to be passed HCR 3 is because you actually are so close, your constituents can actually meet with you. They can talk to you, you're interacting with them. There's a great deal of advantage to that. Convention of States is basically, we're a big tent. We're a grassroots movement. We have 5 million people across the entire country. There's over there are about 16,000 petition signers in New Hampshire alone. So you can see the level of support that we've got. And I think that I'm not going to review any of the stuff that we've gone over. We are concerned about the imperial presidency that's going on, that's accrued powers. And we see all these edicts that are being issued. It doesn't make any difference whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. We know that in 4 years' time, that can be reversed very quickly, 180 degrees. So that's one of the reasons why we need to have something like a convention of states. Now, I passed this out to some of you. I'm not sure if you all have this, but there was a national poll, and I think this is really important for you to understand. First of all, 68% of Americans back a meeting of the states to propose amendments for fiscal responsibility, limits on federal power, and term limits. That's 68%. 59% of Americans trust state legislators more than Congress. That's you. They trust you because you are close to them. And therefore, actually, I think Congress only has like a 17% approval rating. 71% of Americans believe additional limits on federal power are needed. 88% of Americans support term limits for career politicians. That's what got me involved. And if you look at the voter breakdown on this particular poll, and I will be happy to pass this out to you, it's 38% Democrats, 37% Republicans, 18% independents, 7% unaffiliated. So we're a big tent. I think we have to try to strive to meet common ground. And I do request that we respectfully request that you pass this application out of committee for full vote of the House. We see it as critical for this committee to not restrict our constitutional rights without a debate before the entire House, to simply send representatives to propose amendments with other states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Luce.
Great.
Madam Clerk?
Thank you, Mr.
John-
Chairman.
John?
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Mr. Luce, would you want to submit a copy of that document you have there for the record?
Yes, I surely will. I'll bring it up to the.
Thank you.
to Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Gus G. Stratton from Brookfield. Gus, welcome. Mr. Stratton from Brookfield supports the HCR3.
Hi, thank you. After so many of my team members have hit home runs, I feel like Pedro Martinez taking an at bat. In any event, I'm a retired physician, and as a physician, we have to take an oath when we graduate. It's called the Hippocratic Oath. And and one of the most important admonitions of that oath is do no harm. And the way I've looked at Article 5, I see it as a tool, as a remedy. And it's clear that there are many signs and symptoms in our society today, in the economy, where there is significant malaise. And I see Article 5 as a remedy. And I'm hoping to appeal to your sense of ethics, because I know you all swear an oath to the Constitution of New Hampshire and to the United States. And I'm hoping that in your decision, you examine Article 5 as its tool function and as a remedial remedy function in trying to help address these malaise in the economy and in the society at large. And that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the sports metaphor, which we appreciated. Okay, I have the last pink card in my hand now. To stay with sports, batting cleanup after 16 or 17 speakers. Is Joe Torelli still here? Welcome, Joe. If there's anything that has not yet been said, here's your chance.
Well, I do have the rest of the book. This is hard to get used to. Thank you again. Oh, I just lost my clock. Thank you again for having this ability to discuss pros and cons on things. And it's part of not only why we're in New Hampshire, but also America. So I have been listening carefully to the previous testimony from the various folks that have been here. And I don't really have much to say, just to fill in a couple of little gaps. First of all, Representative Belcher, you have 10% of all of the committee member constituent petitions are in your district. Okay, there are others that are higher, but you have 10%. I don't know. I really hope that when I hit the submit button yesterday for my 5 pages, that it actually got to you, because I may have hit the button twice and the error message came up saying you've already submitted. And it's like, I didn't get anything that said that I had submitted except the error that it didn't. So if you do not have the 5-page, I can easily send a PDF or airdrop it to a phone. There's a lot of really good information in here that's good for review between now and executive session, and also to ask subsequent questions. Okay, so Linda used the term conversation, and I'm thinking maybe we could make it Article 5 conversation of states, because they used the word convention back in the 1700s to say it's a meeting. And so I like conversation of states. I'm an undeclared voter in New Hampshire for a lot of reasons. I feel that this is possibly the most nonpartisan effort that could be hitting the United States, because it solves problems for both sides. It comes to compromise, and anybody that goes into a legislature knows that you really can't get anything done without compromise. And when I referred to the previous mention of Charles Pinckney, it originally started May 29th. The assent of the legislature of states shall be sufficient to invest future additional powers in US in C.ASS. Which is in Congress assembled, and shall bind the whole Confederacy. So that was end of May, 1787. When we get to June is when Alexander Hamilton comes in and says, no, it's got to be Congress. So they added Congress to it. And then they compromised as part of the debate process leading into September 10th, is when George Mason, who was twice as old as James Madison at the time. So picture that, James Madison's 26, comes up and says, okay, well, let's put this in, let's put the or and have the state as part of it. So that's a big one. One state, one voice. One state, one vote. 17th Amendment, I look at, needs to be repealed personally, but what the original plan was, it was supposed to be the ambassador representing the state of New Hampshire to the government of the United States. Last point, checks and balances. So we have legislative branch can impeach the executive. The executive can veto to check the legislature, and judicial can strike down legislation. And this is absolutely critical. The framers and the ratifiers chose you, the state legislatures, to break class and emergency. Somebody used my term before. James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, George Mason, and yes, the other George, Washington, bestowed on you, our state legislators, the power and influence to apply for a convention for proposing amendments. I hope you vote in favor of HCR 3, and I hope we get an ability to share this with the rest of the body in the Capitol.
Thank you so much for that and for your submitted testimony. I will point out that there's been a lot of email traffic this week in our committee prepping for today, and I did send a message to all the members with the format so that everybody can know how to go online to see who has submitted online testimony or comment. So I've pushed that out to every committee member, and I'm sure that at some point we all will or should go online and see the likes of what you submitted.
Okay, and there's a chart in there in color, it's much nicer than this, that says what the representative is that's on the committee and how many petitions were signed in that district, along with a couple other interesting points and notes.
Thank you so much for your testimony and for what you've submitted and for being here. And with that, we will call a halt. I will call a halt to the hearing on HCR 3. We have one more this morning that we want to jump right into. The prime is here on the OLS document, the House Concurrent Resolution 5, it says the prime sponsor is Representative Sabarin, but Representative, your correct name is Representative Sabarin D. Chouanier.
Well, everyone, you've been watching a hearing on COS Action's Article 5 resolution in the New Hampshire House Committee on State Federal Relations and Veterans Affairs. We expect the committee to take action on our resolution in executive session on February 7th, so we were not expecting a vote today. But boy, we heard great testimony. Our resolution was introduced by our primary sponsor, Representative J.D. Bernardi. He did a phenomenal job telling the committee members what it's all about, an Article 5 application for a convention to propose amendments on 3 topics: imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and setting term limits for federal officials and members of Congress. He really did an expert job. Representative Bernardi has been a champion of Convention of States for a long time. He has attended our simulated conventions, so he is an expert in the process, and he conveyed that expertise very well to the committee. Then we got to hear from our very own Senator Rick Santorum, and it was neat to see the respect that he obviously commanded from that committee member. The chair of the committee, obviously very pleased to have him there in person for testimony. And Rick did have to get up early and take an early flight this morning and then a long drive to get there in time. So it was well worth it, folks, because Rick Santorum was on fire in that committee room this morning. He was definitely at his best. It may have been his best presentation yet about Convention of States. And I particularly loved the analogy he gave in, talking about, or maybe speaking to, the people who have fear that maybe something could go wrong at convention because we've never had a convention for proposing amendments under Article 5 before. And Senator Santorum said, if your house is on fire and you're across the street, you're taking a risk to cross that street. But are you going to take the risk? Of course you are, because the house is on fire and you're going to cross the street to save your house. So I thought that was an excellent analogy. I think that's the first time I've ever heard that one. But Senator Santorum just did an excellent job of conveying to the committee members the importance of this resolution and why they should support it. Also talked about the process, answered some questions from committee members that had been asked earlier. Now, we were hoping to have Regional Director Haley Shaw here with us to give her reactions. I don't see her yet, but I do see there he is, our chief, Mark Meckler. Mark, thanks for joining me. You were watching the hearing as well. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was amazing. I think one of the most interesting things to me is I feel a little bit bad saying this, but I think my expectations were too low. And the reason I say that is because it's a younger grassroots team there, right? And so when you look at a state like South Dakota, where they've been coming back year after year, 10 years of pushing through the legislature, I have a higher expectation for their level of performance because I just know there's a lot of people that have been doing it a lot of years. So when I see a younger team there, people who haven't necessarily been around for 10 years, John, who's fairly new as a state director, and they come in, they're incredibly well prepared. You commented on our chat, like they're all dressed like legislators, right? And they look absolutely sharp, professional. Their testimony was succinct. They were as good as anybody else. And so I apologize to the New Hampshire team for underestimating you guys. It's just amazing to me to keep seeing the bar go up every year and every team meeting the bar. We've seen a lot of testimony this week and last week, and nothing has disappointed. And when I say nothing, Rita, I mean not a person, right? Yeah. And so that to me is unbelievable. One of the broader things that we're doing with Convention of States, and it's really important to me that people who are watching understand this, it goes beyond the idea of calling a Convention of States. We're raising up a generation of grassroots activists who who understand the process, who know how to go into their legislatures and have an influence, who know how to testify. Ultimately, I promise you, some of those people are going to become legislators. You saw that we had a former legislator there who's a longtime champion of ours testifying on our behalf. So just a regular citizen now, not a legislator. And there are a lot of people that are going to go back and forth like that. We've seen this all over the country in a variety of states where people rise up out of the convention of states grassroots and end up becoming legislators. This is part of the process of doing that. I know I literally remember the first time I walked in and testified in a legislature, Rita, it was in Montana many years ago. And, I've been a lawyer for a lot of years, so I'm comfortable in a courtroom and situations like that. I've done a lot of public speaking, but I remember as I was walking up to the Capitol thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. I've never done this before. I'm terrified. And I remember actually picking up the phone and calling Mike Ferris. I was so inexperienced, I didn't even know what to call the legislators. I was like, do I call them Your Honor? Or how do I do this? And he laughed at me. He said, no, you could just call him Representative or Senator. So we as an organization, me along with it, have come so far since then. It was really impressive. I thought our sponsor did as good a job as I've seen a sponsor do. Different is really interesting to me, different than other legislators have done it. So I think we have a bunch of a bunch of legislators have done a really good job this year. I do think it gets a little confusing, and I don't love it when we have hearings that combine one bill right after another bill on a similar subject. People were clearly confused at the difference between the bill versus the resolution, the bill setting forth how delegates will be chosen and the like. So I think we need to be careful with that. We do the best we can to separate those things, but sometimes we don't have a choice. But I think we as an organization can do a better job advising our folks how to separate out those things. That would be my only constructive criticism. Not that the team didn't do it perfectly. It's that I think we need to do a better job leading on that, I would say. And then finally, I can't forget Rick Santorum. That guy's so good. And it's so hard because you don't expect somebody that good to continue getting better. And he's just, one, he's passionate, but two, he's an absolute professional. He's a pro before a committee. He's a pro on camera. And each time he testifies, I think, man, that's the best I've ever seen Rick. And he did it again today. And he delivered a master class on how to present convention of states. And he did it with passion, with joy. He was winsome. Like everything about what he did, I just thought was perfect.
Absolutely. And, Mark, piggybacking on what you were saying about the grassroots and seeing the grassroots teams across the country and how engaged they are, how knowledgeable and professional they are. And I just wanted to comment, I'm watching on this live stream right now. There are 430 people at this moment watching. And I think what a great thing that is, that even the people who couldn't, for whatever reason, be there to testify, even people from around the country. I know sometimes they put their comments in and tell us where they're watching from. We've had people comment they're in West Virginia, they're in Minnesota, they're in Florida, people from all over the country watching our state legislatures at work and listening to the debate. And they're so engaged. And I just think that's an incredible thing. The committee chair mentioned in the hearing that there was a real civics education going on in that committee room today. He's absolutely right. What do you want to say about that little side benefit of what we're doing?
I mean, this is what we're doing, right? We're teaching people civics all over the country. When people say, what's the worst case scenario for convention of states? My answer is we don't get to a convention. But we conduct the largest civic constitutional education project in history. That's the downside. So that's what we're doing every day. By the way, I'm getting comments in one of our Slack channels. You can see the dogs are in the background. People thought that Winston was chewing on a chew toy. He's actually chewing on Doc. That's
the new puppy.
That's the new chew toy back there. So
I
apologize. That's just life with dogs in the house. I'm surprised. I'm not hearing your dogs barking right now.
I know, not yet. They're quiet at the moment. And Mark, I have to give a shout out to Hawaii. Mark White just reminded me in the chat, Hawaii is in the house. Aloha, and thank you for watching from Hawaii.
I mean, could you be any further away? Like Hawaii to our New Hampshire hearing, that's incredible.
It's amazing. Mark, thank you for joining us for this live stream. And for those of us watching, join us again on Monday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time for a committee hearing in the Kansas Senate. Catch all the action at conventionofstates.com/COS live. Like this video, hit the subscribe button, help us light brush fires of liberty. Now we've got a country to save and Mark has dogs to take care of. So let's get back to work. Thanks for joining us.